Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Hello, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. Before I start, I just want to thank the organizers of the conference. This has been such a wonderful experience for me, just being among wonderful speakers, wonderful ideas being exchanged on this platform. And I think more importantly for me, it's just being among a large group of female philosophers. I've never been in such great company before. So this has been wonderful. Really, I'm grateful to be here. And today I want to invite you to think with me about what we are thinking when we're talking about sisterhood. And I take my cue from Bell Hooks, who talks about sisterhood, and she actually wants us to, or she invites us to think differently about sisterhood in terms of, who causes the problems that cause women to change, to face challenges in society, in the workplace, in just interacting with people in society. And most feminist critiques or feminist debates about what's going wrong and what the reasons are for actually that lead to the oppression or the marginalization of women often blame patriarchy. Bell Hooks doesn't think it's wrong to blame patriarchy, but she does think that we need to turn the view on women and ask how women, fellow women, contribute to the perpetuation of patriarchy in our society. So her tone is more a tone of inviting women to look within and see how it is that they actually relate with other women, and whether in their relating with other women, they're not in fact doing more harm than good. In a sense, perpetuating then the stereotypes that come with patriarchy and perpetuating the very principles that contribute to the consistent oppression and marginalization of women. In this sense, she actually looks at three obstacles. She isolates three obstacles that contribute to creating a view of sisterhood that is rather unattractive and one that women should work to challenge rather than accept with no question. So in her article, she works on, or she deals with the sense of sisterhood, or the definition of sisterhood, as ideally one that speaks to unity and harmony and solidarity among women. And one might add, even those who probably identify as women. But she says there are challenges to this sisterhood, and this challenges are the challenges that actually aim to portray sisterhood as a sort of victimhood. So although the aim is to pursue the solidarity, the harmony, and all those sort of unifying principles that should guide women's relationality, she says they actually perpetuate an idea that women exist in society as victims. So there is some person or some people out there who consistently harm women, and women always exist in society in relations with other people as people who have less power than those who are harming them. She says the problem with this is that it always then reflects or gives the idea of women as individuals who must always be protected, who must always look to somebody to be saved, and can never do anything by themselves. So three things are at play here when we perpetuate the idea of women as victims, or this spirit of victimhood that is actually connected to the idea of sisterhood. And those obstacles are race, sexism, and classism. Because we need to stop thinking about women always in relation to men. So in most instances, when we think about women, it's always a sister, a brother, a sister, a wife, a daughter. So always in relation to men. A daughter has a father, a sister to a brother, a wife to a husband and so forth. And she says, this is problematic because then we never actually allow women to be seen as independent subjects in the world with their own life experience and a rich life experience with which they can actually go out into the world and pull from in their relationality with other beings. Says this is something that we ought to stop, and it's something that actually dovetails into issues of ageism and so forth. So there are many examples in society where you find young women who are related to by older women and often encouraged to just get married, as if your life is meaningless if you're not a wife, your life is meaningless if you're not a mother. And so there's this idea that for a woman to be whole, for a woman to be complete, she needs to necessarily have a relationship with a man. And it is that relationship with a man that actually allows her or gives her the proper standing in society that will then allow her to earn respect from those around her. So, of course, Bell Hooks is against the sexist idea of women. She then shares with us her next obstacle, which is race. And here she says there's a view or a sense of racial superiority that seeps into relations among women. And in this, she blames the bourgeois white liberalists for going out or relating to women or Black women in a way that does not actually challenge the race dichotomy of the superiority and inferiority. So although women fight against patriarchy together, she's saying at some point, race divides white women from Black women in a sense that it becomes a Black woman problem rather than a women problem. And she says this is so evident in the ways in which Black women are sometimes labeled as the angry Black woman when they voice out issues that actually aim to alleviate or challenge the racial discrimination that takes place or that is relevant to their experience. And so what she's trying to say here is that the lived experience of women sometimes, although it can be similar in many ways, when we start looking at the issue of race, we realize that the fight for Black women becomes then different from that of white women. And here she's trying to, I think, expose us to the fact that it need not be that way. And she uses an example of societies, women's societies that purport or that, market themselves as being for all women. And she says there's a place or there's a point at which within those societies, Black women are assimilated into, so that the superiority of white women remains in place. And it is the white women who are making space at the table for Black women. So it stops being a space for everybody, but it's actually the space that is owned or, created by and for mainly white women, and then Black women are brought in to assimilate into that space. So oftentimes these spaces do not change. And the moment that these things are questioned, then there's an immediate defense that sort of comes up that says, but we're not racist. And she's saying, if we are to create these spaces in a way that is that brings in or endorses equity among women across races, then there has to be a sense in which we do not think of them as belonging to a particular race, but rather being an open space for everybody. And in order to do that, then we need to look at the power dynamics. So it stops being white women who have the authority over these spaces, and then they just make space for Black women to assimilate into. So here she's trying to push a transformative agenda of the spaces that women come together to do work or discuss issues or whatever the case may be. After her idea on race, she then moves on to the idea of classism, which is really closely related to the idea of race. So if I think about the way that she speaks about classism, it's also a power dynamic at play there. And here she says, class does sort of creep into the relations among women in a way that in most societies, in my society in South Africa especially, there are certain shall I call them workspaces that have become relegated to Black people. And those workspaces are not workspaces of superior, I don't know, earning capacity. It's mostly, for instance, just to be direct, the housekeeping, if I could call it an industry in South Africa, while it is owned by white women, it's the Black women who are actually the employees. And you'll never, hardly ever, find a white woman who's a housekeeper anyway. And here she says the classism, if we look at it in relation to race and so forth among women, then we realize that these two are so intertwined that we cannot quite pull them apart from each other at any moment, because there's some kind of intersectional relation between these aspects in society, but still something that we should all, when we are talking about transforming spaces for women and endorsing or championing sisterhood, then these are the obstacles that we need to look at. This is different. This is a very different approach, but quite related to what Drusilla Cornell talks about when she talks about the need to identify, the need to recognize women's deontological core. While she's talking, Drusilla Cornell, when she's talking about the deontological core, she's discussing it in relation to how legislature works and how we have to take cognizance of the fact that the laws that govern the society are laws that are actually very exclusive, and they exclude women. And she says, if we're to think of these laws, and I think each of us from our different societies can think about instances where the law often fails women. One very common thing that happens in South Africa is when women go to the police stations and they they report instances of abuse by their partners or any other man in the family or in the society. Sometimes the police have very, very horrible responses to women, often telling women, go back and sort this out. This is a relationship problem. This is a private problem between you and your partner. Go back and just talk it out. And in these instances, this is part of the reason we have such high gender-based violence and femicide numbers in South Africa. It's because the law is, in most cases, never on the side of the women. And so women continue, or they're forced to continue to suffer in silence. And Drusilla Cornell gives us an interesting way to sort of look at what is going on in our societies in relation to law. And this dovetails with what Bell Hooks says, because even here you have women who will, for instance, in some cultures in South Africa, when women are married, at the tea party or at the kitchen tea, I forget, or the bachelorette party, the older women, and here ageism becomes an issue. So the intergenerational relationships among women then becomes something that comes into play and becomes relevant to the lived experience of women. So you'll find that in these events, older women will tell the younger women that, once you're married, you belong to your husband. You belong to your husband's family. Don't come running back here when things go wrong. So whatever happens, you're a woman now. You must be able to resolve it. And in discussions of gender-based violence and femicide in our society, there's often been a call towards older women to stop this kind of advice, because it's actually the advice that kills cause that contributes to the killing of women. Because if you have nowhere to run away from, if you are living in a space where you are beaten and abused verbally, physically, emotionally, whichever way, and the people who are supposed to support you, the women who are supposed to have your back, the sisters who are supposed to be there for you, tell you that it's your problem, then there is an issue there. So ageism also comes into play because there are some women who hold on more strongly to the patriarchal values or the patriarchal norms that govern society, and they don't stop to question these laws. They don't stop to challenge these laws or norms. And while when the younger generation questions these laws, then, the name calling begins, right? So anyway, getting back to Drusilla Cornell talks about this deontological core. And she says what society needs to start doing when relating to women or supporting women or trying to develop women's sense of self and so forth is to actually pay attention to the deontological core, which is a core that actually speaks to the subjective experience of women in society. We cannot continue in this world to live without actually considering or listening to the subjective lived experience of women in society, as it is indeed quite different. In order for us to pay attention to this deontological core, and she says we cannot really resolve issues of for women or relate with women if we continue to ignore the deontological core, because it is from the women's lived experience that we're able to hear what the problem is. So if we fail to pay attention to their subjective lived experience, then how can we understand what their experience of society is? So here, when we talk about women relating to other women or women relating to people in general in the world, then what we are talking about is how we see or we perceive their deontological core, or how women themselves share that deontological core. And here of course, you can talk about issues of self-knowledge become quite important. So again, here I think she's trying to warn that people must stop talking on behalf of women. People must start allowing women to speak and encourage women to speak out or express themselves in terms of what they think is going wrong in society and what they think could help. But she says for this kind of conversation, for this kind of interaction to happen, for us to be able to start talking about these issues, for us to even start recognizing the deontological core, we need a space, and she calls this space the imaginary domain. She says the imaginary domain is a space where nobody has more rights than another. Nobody has less rights than another. Everybody is equal. Everybody has, a space to express themselves, to challenge norms, and whatever the case may be. But she says, for as long as we live in a patriarchal world where the men are given a more priority, or the needs or the wants of the men are given more priority than those of the women, then we will continue to have a problem. And what she shares here is quite relevant to our everyday experience. When we talk about gender-based violence and femicide, at some point, so in South Africa, the gender-based violence and femicide cases spiked around about 2019 in September. And they haven't really gone down since. And we had, because of COVID-19, we had a couple of lockdowns. And at some point, we had a hard lockdown where you could not move, you could not leave your house, you could not leave your space unless you were going to get groceries or you had some kind of permit. And in that time, it was between lockdown level 5 and 4, there was an even higher increase in gender-based violence and femicide cases. And what was most frustrating was when reading about, people trying to figure out what is the problem, is obviously, what I mentioned earlier about not having a place to run to, not having a safe haven. So the place where you're stuck with your abuser day and night. There's nowhere to go. So it took a while, but after some time, maybe a month or two, I can't say for sure, but people did start creating safe havens for these women during that lockdown space or time. But what is frustrating is how, and here you see that phallocentric sort of way in which people understand the world. People started questioning, but it could be that these men have psychological problems and that's why they're being abusive. So the women are expected in these horrible times or those horrible events of abuse, they're supposed to sympathize with their abuser and try to understand why their abuser is abusing them. Instead of pulling them out of the space, there was just this call of, it could be that this person has multiple personality disorder or schizophrenia, or they're frustrated. And this one is the one that I thought was quite ridiculous, was that, no, in the past couple of decades, there's been a rise in women getting jobs and being developed so they can build their careers and so forth. So now you have more women who are earning a salary or becoming breadwinners in these households, and the men are struggling to deal with it. And I'm thinking, whoa, really? This is where we're at? And I think Cornell helps us to understand or to think about this imaginary domain where we do not excuse men for doing horrific things. And we actually are able to hold them accountable. Because at this moment, one of the problems with the gender-based violence and femicide is that we're not able to hold them accountable. I just want to share one more, and then I want to move to another argument I'd like to share in relation to this idea of sisterhood. And here again, sisterhood seems to fail. We had a case a couple of months ago, or was it last year? I can't quite remember. I'm so bad with dates. But we had a woman, a pregnant woman, who was having the man was having an extramarital affair with this woman, and she happened to fall pregnant. And the story is, he tried to get her to get an abortion, but she refused because she wanted to have the baby. As the pregnancy developed, I think it was in the 3rd trimester, he hung her to die with the fetus in her body. So he literally killed this woman and her baby for the mere reason that he didn't want to ruin his marriage. So there were, there's Twitter and all these other social media platforms, but every now and then there was a woman who would say something as horrible as, well, what was she thinking? She was a homewrecker. She deserved what was coming to her because she messed with a marriage. But at no point do these women try and change their view to consider what it is that legitimizes or justifies a man using women as means to an end, to a point where their lives mean so little. Anyway, so this is the problem then with patriarchal spaces that give so much to men and so little to women. And she thinks the imaginary domain might be a space where we're able to equalize this. All of this, from the ideas by bell hooks on race, class, and sexism, and Cornell's idea of the imaginary domain, I understand them to be calls for recognition. And in this sense, I'd like to use the ideas by Heike Ikäheimo. He tries to capture recognition as a pursuit of certain recognitive attitudes that matter to a human being's psychological welfare or just the psyche. And he identifies love, respect, and esteem as the recognitive attitudes that ought to be protected in society, in any kind of interaction. And these are all violated when we have race, classism, and sexism. He talks about persons in general, he says, are people who can be seen, or we can try to understand personhood according to 3 dimensions. And he gives us the cooperative dimension. And with the cooperative dimension, he makes a distinction between egoistic and altruistic relations or attitudes towards people. He says the one that we ought to avoid is the egoistic cooperative dimension, because that allows people to use others as instruments for their own gains. And I think this is what we find in these cases of gender-based violence and femicide, is that there's a way in which people have accepted or are complicit in accepting that women are things that exist for the use of men. The other dimension he talks about is the axiological dimension. And here he talks about the value of persons, that there's something about your value as an individual that should be recognized when you are interacting with other people. And it should be that value that calls or demands respect from the next person, so that there's a block or some kind of moving away from violating other people because of the recognition of the value that they hold as persons in the world. The third one, and I think it's I pretty much think that this is what's missing, even in sisterhood or with feminism, with patriarchal norms that control society, is the deontic value and the deontic dimension. And here he talks about the deontic dimension where people or persons are co-authors of norms that govern the societies within which they live. And I think when Drusilla Cornell is talking about the imaginary domain, this is in part what she's looking for, that women should start be recognized as co-authors of the norms that govern their behavior, but also the behavior of other people, that they're not seen simply as receptors, and from being the receptors of those norms, that they just oblige or abide by them. So all these issues that talk to sisterhood, even the very idea that sisters or sisterhood is an idea or sense of being that places women in position of victimhood, is one that we can look at, or we can try to unpack by looking at these dimensions of personhood, that being the cooperative dimension, the axiological dimension, as well as the deontic dimension. And that as we move through the space as people in society, what we ought to do is always be cognizant of which principles are at work when we're interacting with one another, and allow a kind of openness to being wrong. Because I think if we respect each other's deontological cores, then our lived experience will never be always at the same time the same. It will never be identical. But for us to learn and develop and work together, in ways that will actually be useful for all women and not just some women, then we need to consistently interrogate these obstacles of race, classism, and sexism, and look at how we actually sometimes ignore them, or sometimes are not aware of them when they're at play, and just have the openness then to being told when they are. Because I think one of the problems, and Bell Hooks sort of hints at this, is that one of the problems is that there's a lot of labeling that happens in society. So that the moment you stand up for something, there's a label for you. And sometimes we're too quick to make judgments. And in this mediated world where the cancel culture is so rife, one might even be afraid to express things because they don't want to have the responses that make them feel as if they are either racist or classist or sexist. But if I can just quickly round off, I'm aware of the time now. Sisterhood is a complex concept with which we, even today in this conference, we are interacting in a space that is meant to create this and endorse the spirit of sisterhood among us. This is what women pursue when they talk, in part, when they're talking about feminist agendas, when they're talking about feminist debates and so forth. And I think what these thinkers that I have presented today are trying to communicate to us is that women are persons who are active in the world, and we ought to respect them in their own right as persons. But in doing so, we ought not to forget the challenges that do contribute to the marginalization and the oppression of women. I hope you enjoyed the talk. I will leave it there. And
Thank you so much. Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much.